So, we're going to be looking at the historical and cultural foundations of marriage, beginning with the Jewish and Roman roots of Christian marriage. And the thing that I want to remind you of, just like we saw with the biblical and theological perspective at our last forum, is that there is not a monolithic approach to what marriage is through history and culture. Just like we saw in the Old Testament, we began with bigamy, where a man would have more than one wife. That was common. And then we have polygamy, many different wives with one husband, to where we get to monogamy with the New Testament era, where it's going to be husband and wife. So there's not just one biblical standpoint on marriage, or theological standpoint. And what you're going to see is that through history and culture, our definition of marriage changes as well. So we're going to start, though, with the church. We have to begin with the Jewish and the Roman roots, that soil out of which marriage grows. And so the first mention that we get of a marriage liturgy in the Bible, anything like a marriage liturgy, interestingly enough, comes to us from what is known as the intertestamental, the Apocrypha. So if in your Bibles at home, the Apocrypha, that part of the Bible perhaps that we don't always first go to, they call it the non-canonical books. They're important for us to read, but not necessarily have the same status as the Old and New Testament. Books like the Wisdom of Solomon, books like Ecclesiasticus, and also Tobit. And so you have the wedding of Tobias and Sarah in the Apocrypha. And what you see there, number one, in these Jewish and Roman roots, is that marriage is involving several phases and different parties. So in our time, we think primarily of the couple, but in antiquity, in the Jewish and Roman times, you're going to have particularly fathers from both families involved in the negotiations for a marriage. And there's going to be a several-step process, beginning with betrothal, and we'll talk more about the legal status of betrothal, which is similar to our engagement, but even more formal, you could say. There's a multi-step process that happens before marriage in the Jewish and Roman world. So that blessing of Tobias that I mentioned before is absolutely beautiful. This is what we see in the Apocrypha. And I'm not going to read this entire paragraph to you, but the part that I want to spotlight is where Tobias says, I now take this is towards the bottom, I now take this, my beloved, to wife, not out of lust, but in true marriage. Grant that she and I may find mercy and grow old together. And they both said, Amen. There's so much I love about this passage. Beginning with not out of lust, but in true marriage. In other words, not to objectify each other, or particularly the wife in this situation, but to cherish and to love. And when we lust after someone, of course, we turn them into an object, an idol. And when we cherish and serve the other, we are marrying in love. And so there's a distinction there, which I think is helpful. Grant that she and I might find mercy. There's a part in the Episcopal marriage service where we say, when the couple hurts each other, may they forgive each other. There's an acknowledgement from the outset that the couple will need to show mercy to each other through the years, forgive each other, find mercy, and grow old together. That's where we get that phrase. I can't wait to grow old with you. That goes all the way back to the Bible, to the blessing of Tobias. And I love this. There's a mutuality here. They both said, Amen. They both said, Amen. Partnership. The blessing of Tobias. Okay, so now we are going to go to the 3rd century, specifically from the Jewish perspective. So here, what you'll find is that the Jewish Talmud, which is commentary on the scriptures, very, very authoritative for Jews, The Talmud, which is a multi-volume set of commentaries, sheds some light on marriage beginning in the 3rd century. And what we see there in the Talmud is that marriage is primarily a 2-step process: betrothal and the actual marriage, which usually happens about a year later. So let's begin with betrothal. In this situation, money is exchanged between the families. Contracts, legal contracts, are negotiated for what we would call the engagement, the betrothal. And in some cases, this is when cohabitation begins. Interestingly enough, in our own time and place, very often, when I am doing premarital preparation for couples, they're already living together, even though they're not married. And that is very common in our time and place. And it was very common in antiquity that as soon as the contracts were signed, and sometimes money was exchanged, that's when the couple would begin cohabiting. Sometimes, not in all cases. And that was also a time, interestingly enough, when blessings were given, not by a priest, not by the rabbi, but by members of the family. Very often the fathers would bless the couple. So this is a key thing for you to keep in mind as we start tonight, is that marriage in the ancient world was a domestic situation. You wouldn't go to the temple. You wouldn't go to a religious building. The marriage happened at home. Blessings were given by parents or other family members, and it was all negotiated between the families. The marriage event would very often happen about a year, just like, engagement versus the actual marriage ceremony, about a year after the betrothal. During that time of the marriage, there would be additional blessings and prayers given by members of the family, very often to prepare for the wedding, fasting, confession of sins, kind of starting with a clean slate. And I love this detail, crowns. Crowns, interestingly enough, if you've ever been to an Eastern Orthodox wedding, are very, very important. We'll talk more about that later. But crowns were put on to signify that dignity that comes through the vows taken at marriage. If the bride was still a virgin, a veil would be used at the marriage service. Remember that many of the couples, once they're betrothed, are cohabiting already. And so it was very common for the bride not to be a virgin. There would be a formal signing, a ceremonial signing, we might say, of the marriage contract. Interestingly enough, we still have something like that here at St. John's. In the little booklet, looking here at Ellie, who's recently married here. In the booklet that you get here, you have to sign like a little certificate. And so what we've actually started doing at the marriage services here at St. John's is doing that as part of the marriage service. There's something special about that. Just like you do it in ordination, you kind of sign those promises and those vows that you're making. So there would be a formal signing of the marriage contract. Of course, what would be a wedding without feasting, music, dancing? You've heard me teach before that in Jesus' time and in Jewish weddings time, it was not one night of receptions. Very often it was a week of partying. That's why that wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, where Jesus turns the water into wine, is so important, because they ran out of wine early. It would have been a complete bummer. It would have been very embarrassing for these families to run out of wine, And so Jesus, there's a lot of spiritual meaning going on, but he also didn't want to see that couple so disappointed. He really cared about them. So it's partying, celebrating. It's important. This is what marriage is about. It's about joy. So while there was always these legal aspects of marriage, even in antiquity, at the end of the day, it's about love, it's about joy, it's about feasting, it's about dancing, okay? Just like our own time and place. This is an example of groom's blessing that comes to us from Talmud, just so you can see some liturgical fragments, if you will, that come to us from the ancient world. The groom's blessing: "Oh, make these loved companions greatly to rejoice, even as of old thou didst gladden thy creature in the Garden of Eden. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who makes bridegroom bride to rejoice. We're going to move now to the Greco-Roman background. Okay? This is where we get into the Roman world, the Greek world. Here, we move to a situation where there's a great emphasis on the patriarchal family. You have the paterfamilias, head of household, and it's a very stratified household that, by the way, is not limited to the nuclear family. You're going to have multi-generations of people living under the same roof. You're going to have slaves and free. Keep in mind that the economy during this time period is mostly a household, cottage-based economy. So when you're looking at a household, it's just not where you live. This would be your center of business. This would be multi-generations of families. These households were big. Do you remember the story of Cornelius in the book of Acts, the first Gentile who's admitted to the church in the book of Acts? When Cornelius and his household are baptized, it was a very large group of people. It wouldn't have just been Cornelius' wife and a few kids. It would have been a big group of people that are now entering and being welcomed into the church. So we see that in Roman marriage, you have a change in the legal and the familial status of women. This is unlike Jewish marriage, okay, where you have basically a woman moving from one household to another, taking the name of her husband, which of course is going to reinforce patrilineal lines and values. Fathers did maintain sometimes the right to have kind of oversight over their daughter, even when the daughter was married. And so in those legal contracts that were negotiated for marriages, sometimes fathers would not let go. That never happens nowadays, right? So, you know, I'm being serious though, there was a legal status here, and fathers would not let go. However, and this is an interesting little detail, occasionally fathers would, quote unquote, emancipate their daughters to have their own businesses, to essentially be on their own. And many scholars think that the women that follow Jesus, many of the women that follow Jesus, may have been in this group, where they actually had quite a bit of autonomy, quite a bit of power, and significant wealth. And these were business owners, leaders in their community, and they didn't have to answer to a husband who had that oversight over them. They had that own sense of freedom. Now this is important. Only Roman citizens can marry. And so you have a very stratified world in the Roman world where only citizens can enter into that marriage contract. You'll remember, to use a different example, with St. Paul. St. Paul is a Roman citizen, and that gave him a lot of power when he was negotiating with leaders and he was being tried. He had the ability to appeal all the way to the emperor because he was a citizen of Rome. Peter, you'll remember, was not. And so church tradition has it that St. Paul, when he was martyred, was decapitated. Not to get gross, but St. Paul was decapitated. That's why you always see St. Paul with a sword, which would have been a merciful way to die. St. Peter, who was not a citizen of Rome, crucified upside down, a humiliating death. Because he was not a citizen. So in the marriage world, we see that great power comes to those who are able to form a household, and therefore only citizens in Rome were allowed to marry. Let's talk about the early church. Jesus begins to teach something that's fairly radical. And you'll remember the stories in the Bible where his mother and siblings come to Jesus, and he'll be in someone's home, teaching, preaching, healing, maybe having dinner with someone. And someone will come to him and say, Jesus, your mom and your siblings are outside. And he'll say, those who do the will of God and who follow me are my family. And you're like, wait a minute, Jesus, that's not very nice. Jesus is not saying that his family doesn't matter. The point that's being made here is that anyone who does the will of God and follows Jesus as a disciple is part of God's family, is part of Jesus' family. So family is being redefined in the New Testament to include all who are invited into the church, all who hear the good news and respond to it. And so mothers and fathers in the church are those who bring people from outside of the church in, who invite them in. And so there's a whole new definition of family going on in the New Testament. Interestingly enough, in the early church, celibacy is seen as an ideal. Why? Because Jesus is coming back tomorrow, or in 15 minutes. And I'm not trying to be facetious here. I mean, there was an urgency. Paul and others believe that Jesus is coming back any second now, and therefore it is preferable to be celibate. But as a concession to human weakness, then you can enter into marriages if you need to do that. But again, the ideal is celibacy. Now, Christian marriage, what we see in the scriptures, particularly in what are called the pastoral epistles, the pastoral letters, what we see there is that more so than in the Roman world, there's an emphasis on mutuality and partnership in the marriage. So even in those passages, wives be subject to your husbands, okay? Ephesians 5 and others, where you see kind of the wife in the relationship has to kind of take second to the husband. Even in those passages, you see an emphasis on mutuality and partnership that would have not been evident in the Roman world. So Christian marriage, while not where we are today with marriage and its emphasis on partnership and mutuality, was certainly much better than the typical couple in the Roman world. Okay? And to go back to the Jewish roots, one last point. Marriage rites are still domestic. They're happening within the household, yet they do have spiritual or religious significance. But my point is that people were still not going to the church to get married. It was all done in the home. Okay? And we'll come back to that point because I actually see our own time being more like this time of the early church, where you see more and more marriages happening at the beach or a resort or someone's backyard. No judgments there. I'm just saying that's more common nowadays. In an interesting way, that's more like it was in the early church. We're going to shift gears and move to the time of St. Augustine. Okay, so we're at the end of the Roman Empire here. And St. Augustine is certainly one of the most important voices of what is known as the patristic era, the church fathers, those first 3 to 4 centuries of the church. St. Augustine commends marriage. You don't see the same type of ambivalence about marriage that you see earlier in the scriptures. However, and this won't surprise you knowing St. Augustine, the bishop needs to be the person to arrange the marriages. So he puts an emphasis on the episcopal office and its involvement in the community, and particularly with marriage arrangements. And he calls marriage a sacred obligation, a sacramentum, not to be confused with a sacrament. We're not there yet. We won't get to marriage as a sacrament until the Middle Ages, but it is seen as a sacred obligation. Now, in the Roman world in which St. Augustine inhabits, very often at non-Christian weddings, there would have been offerings to the gods. And so it won't surprise you to hear that St. Augustine says, don't do that. You are the sacrifice, the couple, to God. The couple becomes the sacrifice that's offered to one God. And the purpose of marriage for St. Augustine, first is fidelity, then procreation, and then fulfilling that sacred obligation that I mentioned before. And interestingly, the marriage vows are focused on the bride in this era. That the bride is the sole subject of the rite, and the bride is to love one's husband as Christ loves the church. What you begin to see here is a spiritualizing of marriage, just like we do today, where marriage represents the union between Christ and Christ's church. You might be wondering, this is the Western Church. How about the Eastern Church? Think about the Greek, Russian Orthodox, that's what I mean by the East, primarily at this point in the Mediterranean basin. Celibacy in the Eastern tradition is also considered ideal. We see a nuptial blessing given to both bride and groom rather than just bride. And I mentioned before about the crowns. They wear crowns as signs of the high calling of Jesus on their lives. And there's a beautiful emphasis in the East on how marriage is repair of God's broken creation. That we live in a world shattered by sin and disobedience, and marriage is a sign, a sacrament. Sacrament's pushing it. We're not sacraments yet. It's a sign, a symbol that God is healing creation. And marriage in the East is very much seen as a calling. In the same way that I emphasize when I teach couples today, I say that one of the first things I'll say to a couple is that marriage is a form of discipleship, one of the highest forms of Christian discipleship. It's your way of following Jesus. By loving each other sacrificially, and through that sense of mutuality and mutual joy, you are following Jesus. It's a way to express our faith. Let's go to the Middle Ages. I know we're going pretty fast through the eras here, but let's go to the Middle Ages. Celibacy, still seen as ideal here, and the domestic life in the Middle Ages is seen as now inferior. We have a really interesting shift in the Middle Ages where the church becomes, the holy ground where you need to have all your important ceremonies in life, and the home is seen as not as important. Where religious vocations are seen as more than a regular vocation, at work in the world, to be a farmer, or whatever it is. Suddenly there is a status given to those who are part of the religious life. And only celibate priests in this era can offer those marital blessings. It's taken away from the domestic sphere, and only the church now can dispense the blessing. Fathers are not going to be asked to give that blessing in the same way that they did in the earliest centuries of the church. This is the time of feudalism. You remember this from school history. It's also a time where you see in the church the veneration of Mary. Mary, the mother of our Lord, becomes very, very important. And romantic love in the Middle Ages, as many of you know, has a new place in the relationship. Before it was kind of a legal contract, two families negotiating. Now romantic love, courtship enters into the picture. And for women, this has both positive and negative effects, particularly if you think about the veneration of Mary. Women in this time are not as vilified as perhaps they might have been in earlier eras. However, women are also put up on a pedestal. Just think of all of the medieval art with Mary. Are put on a pedestal and can be idealized as noble, chaste, fragile beings. And so you kind of see pros and cons in these Middle Ages concerning marriage. Now, in the Middle Ages, what you also see economically is a growing middle class. Okay, and what that's leading to is many more marriages, because when you're thinking about marriage contracts, very often the families at least thought about them as property, as the putting together of two families coming together that would be a different economic unit. So when you have more of a middle class, more and more people are getting married. And the couple, rather than just the father, gives consent to the marriage. There's more agency now on the couple. And as I said before, marriage, which was a domestic matter previously, is now seen as something that has to happen within the sphere of the church. And we see in the High Middle Ages, this is the time of Aquinas and others, the scholastic era of the church, where marriage becomes a full-blown sacrament of the church, seen on the same light as Eucharist, as baptism, and we're going to see how this changes in the Reformation, okay? And this is my point before, is there's not this monolithic tradition about marriage. What you see is it's changing through the years, sometimes returning to an earlier status. So, I've been talking a bunch. What I want you to do is have some more time for table discussion for about 10 minutes or so. And I want us to think together about betrothal or engagements. So many of the elements that have been subsumed into our contemporary marriage rite began as part of the Jewish, Roman, or medieval world. So I'm wondering, just for discussion tonight, what benefit does betrothal or engagement offer a couple in the communities in which that couple are members? And how might contemporary betrothal/engagement practices be augmented to further support the process of marriage? Does that question make sense? How can we make our engagement periods, which are similar to betrothal, not the same, but similar, how can we make those periods of time even more life-giving to not only the couple, but to the whole community, the whole Christian community? Take about 10 minutes for that discussion.